What if I told you that ISO has little to nothing to do with the amount of noise you see in your images? Hey everyone, welcome into Magnolia Photography SC. I'm Jeff House, and I'm a wildlife photographer in Charleston, South Carolina. So I made a pretty bold statement to open up this show. And what would you say if I told you that ISO has little to nothing to do with the noise levels in your images? Now, I'm pretty certain this goes against everything you've ever been taught or told when it comes to taking pictures or, anything to do with photography. Because as we're learning, as we're developing in photography, we probably hear a million times, right? You got to watch what you set your ISO to because that creates noise in your images. You need to make sure you're at 400 ISO if you really want those nice clean images with no noise. Man, as you go up to 2500 or 3200, your images are just going to become so noisy. And as you get to 6400 or higher in your ISO, you're probably going to just completely destroy your images. They're going to fall apart. They're going to be so noisy. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's not really true. And I want you guys, I'm going to ask a favor of you today. I want you to hang in with me for this entire video because I think that for many of you out there, this is your thought process when it comes to ISO. And I think that by the time this video is done and you walk away, I think you're going to have learned a lot of new concepts. And I truly believe that for many of you, it's going to change how you approach your wildlife photography. And that's a pretty bold statement. And I'm not saying that to bait you in. I'm not saying that to be, ridiculous or make any false promises. This is something that I truly believe because it is something for me when I learned it that really changed how I photograph wildlife. So I hope that you kind of get the same benefits and the same knowledge that I did. But I want to jump in right away to this video because we have a lot to cover today. We're going to talk about things like light meters and histograms really quickly because it does kind of play a part in today's discussion. But first of all, I want to talk about, let's understand what causes noise in our photographs, right? There are essentially two things that cause noise in our photographs, and that is the amount of photons or light that we're able to collect when we're taking a picture. And the second part is electronic noise, which is something that is created internally inside of our cameras. Now let's start with the electronic noise, because to be fair to camera manufacturers, to be fair to the topic of noise levels in our images, if this was 10 or 15 years ago, well, electronic noise would be more of a relevant discussion, because the technology just wasn't as good as it is today, and cameras generated a little bit more electronic noise internally, which, of course, in turn, created more noise in our photographs. But manufacturers have done a really good job at controlling the electronic noise, and this has greatly reduced what kind of noise is generated from our cameras inside. So it's really not that big of an issue anymore. Does ISO as a whole create more noise in our images? Well, ISO to some degree will create some noise in our images, but it is far from what we are taught or far from what most of us probably currently believe about ISO. It really isn't that big of a factor. And to really understand ISO, what we need to really take from the conversation is that ISO is nothing more than a brightness control. It's very similar to a volume knob or a dimmer switch that you might find in your home, right? You might all be familiar with these dimmer switches, right? A little round knob on the wall, and it doesn't work like your traditional light switch that flips up and down, right? This round knob, you can push it in or out, and that will turn the lights on or off. But from there, you can turn it to the left, and that will reduce the power coming out of the light bulbs, right? And dim the light and make the room darker. Or we can turn it to the right, and that's going to give power to the light bulbs, and that's going to make the light bulbs brighter and bring more light into the room. That's really what ISO is doing in a nutshell, right? It's just helping us to control the overall brightness of our image. What is really behind the noise that we find in our image are the settings we use for our aperture and our shutter speed. Now, that kind of leads us into the second part of what causes noise in our images. We know that if we use a slower shutter speed, right, like 1/60 or 1/100, if we use that shutter speed compared to 1/2000, we're going to be letting a lot more light into our camera. And when we let more light into our camera, we allow more photons into our camera. And again, I'm not a scientist, but photons are simply the small particles found in light. So as we can collect more light and as we can collect more photons and we allow more of that to hit our sensor, we are going to improve what is referred to as our signal to noise ratio, right? Our signal to noise ratio is the light ratio versus the noise ratio. So more light, better signal to noise ratio, cleaner images. Less light, a worse signal to noise ratio, and more noise we have in our images. So that is what causes noise in our images. Let's just look at it as light and electronic noise. But we know electronic noise is really being well controlled nowadays. So it's really more so what's going on with the amount of light that we are gathering during the photo capture process. So we're really talking about something here, right? When we're talking about light gathering and photons and all this scientific stuff, we're really just talking about exposure to some degree. If I were to ask you right now, what controls exposure, what would your answer be? Now, I'm going to guess that the majority of you right now are going, oh, Jeff, that's pretty easy, right? It's a combination of your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. And really, you are partially right. Yes, shutter speed and aperture are what really control our exposure. And we've always been taught that ISO controls our exposure, but it really doesn't. ISO, again, is just a knob that changes the brightness level of our images. And yes, you could make the argument, well, if it's changing the brightness level, then it's changing the exposure. And yes, again, technically we could make that argument. But what we're really focused on today is what settings are really the dictator of exposure, and it is our aperture and our shutter combinations. So when we are taking a picture and we're looking through our camera's viewfinder, we will see a meter somewhere in that viewfinder, right? And we'll have a set of numbers, and if you go to the left, it's underexposed, and if you go to the right, it's overexposed. So let's kind of jump in and take a look at a simulated light meter here. Okay, so if we're looking at this light meter, here is the numbers that I was referring to. And of course, like I just said, if it goes to the left, we have an underexposed or a darker image. If it goes to the right, we'll have an overexposed or a brighter image. And your light meter will look similar to this. It most likely has more numbers than what we're seeing here, but this is just for demonstration purposes again. What we want to understand is that how most people will explain this light meter is when we have this little black dot, right? This is going to move as we change our settings in our camera. But most people refer to this position as the perfect exposure. Now, if you have listened to me talk about exposure before, you probably know what's coming, but I absolutely can't stand the term perfect exposure. There is no such thing as a perfect exposure just because this line is sitting over the zero. This is what is referred to as a balanced exposure, not a perfect exposure. And the reason why this annoys me so much, and I know you think I'm probably being nitpicky right now, but why this annoys me so much is for you newer photographers. Every time someone's talking to you about exposure or talking to you about light meters, every time you hear the word, this is the perfect exposure, this is the perfect exposure, when you go out to take pictures, you are going to be striving to get light meters, right, or images that have this balanced exposure look where this black dot is over the zero. And I'm here to tell you especially in wildlife photography, where we deal with a lot of challenges when it comes to lighting, this black dot being over the zero is not always going to be a perfect exposure. If you are photographing a very bright white bird, I can assure you that there are going to be, most cases probably, if you're at zero, you're going to be way overexposed. In fact, you may be so overexposed having a balanced exposure that you are going to clip highlights, meaning that you are going to be losing detail in the whitest parts of your image. And even when you're shooting raw file formats, when you clip the highlights, when you lose that detail, it can't be recovered, even with those raw file formats. So that's important to understand, because if we start losing detail in our images, it's really going to degrade our images, and they will most likely get to the point of being unusable, right? You won't want to edit them. You won't want to share them because they're just going to look awful. Now, conversely, if we're photographing a black bird, or we're photographing a dark brown bird, anything of a real dark nature, if we're at zero, that's probably not going to be the perfect exposure either. We're probably going to have to take our exposure up to +1 or +2, right? If we're photographing that white bird, we're probably going to have to be at -1 or -2 in order to make sure that we don't blow out those highlights. But that dark bird, we're going to do just the opposite. We're going to go to +1, +2, because we want to prevent the shadows of our images from getting too dark. Because once again, if things get too dark in the image, we can lose detail even in the shadow areas. And again, we won't be able to extract the detail from those portions of the image because it will be lost. It will be considered a true black, and we will lose the detail in those images. This is why we have to be really careful with our exposure. There may be times when you're out there taking a picture, and let's just say you're photographing that bright white bird, and maybe you go down where your light meter is -1, -2, and you get back and you're looking at your photos and you have some of those highlight warnings, right? We have highlight warnings, and I'm in DxO right now. Just as a quick side note, I have left Lightroom Classic. I'm now using DxO Photolab 8 as my full-time photo editor. But down here in this left-hand corner, every editing software pretty much has this, but these are warnings that we can turn on. So this, if we turn these on, it will show us in color, different colors, whether or not we have highlights that are blown out or shadows that are so crushed that they've lost detail. So that's just kind of a good reference point. But if you take your photos into the editing and you see that you have lost detail in these areas, it may be just some very insignificant areas that have lost detail, right? If you've properly exposed your subject, well, maybe you have a part of your sky that's a little blown out, or maybe you have some high grass in the background, and in between those grass blades, way down deep, you're getting some true blacks, and the shadow areas are just not recoverable there. Well, those aren't really big deals, right? Those are really insignificant parts of the image. There's nothing integral about those two parts of the image. So it's okay if we make some sacrifices there and lose a little detail in some of those minor little spots. What we're talking about here, what we're aiming for here, is really talking about our subject and the other integral parts of the image. And that's why we really want to do a good job of controlling our exposure, is so that we can retain all of this information. The light meter is designed to help us do that. Now, two things with the light meter that are important. One, the light meter is seeing the world in 18% gray. And that's what helps us to arrive at what should be a pretty decent exposure. 18% gray is just determined to be a tone of gray that is the most neutral, right? The best neutral color for creating good exposure. And so that's how our camera sees it. And when the camera is, when we lift our camera to point it at the scene that we're going to photograph, it's assessing the light in the scene, and it's helping us to say, hey, this is a little underexposed or a little overexposed. This is what I would recommend you do. But what we need to keep in mind there is our camera has no idea what we're photographing. It's only looking really at tonal ranges. So this is where we as photographers have to say, hey, I know you're seeing this photo right now as a little underexposed, but I'm photographing a white bird. So this is where I need my exposure to be so that I can secure the details of that white bird, right? Makes sense? Right? Because that's what's happening with the light meter. The other important thing that we want to realize about light meters is that light meters are set up to evaluate the scenes as though we're shooting in the JPEG format. Well, I know many of you may be shooting in JPEG format, and I strongly encourage you to shift over to the RAW file format. Reason being, especially in wildlife, reason being is we are dealing with difficult lighting conditions all the time in wildlife photography. When we use the RAW file format, we are going to have greater dynamic ranges, right? And dynamic ranges, if you remember, I've talked about this in past videos quite a bit. It's the difference, it's how many tonal ranges, right, that we have between the brightest image to the darkest image, the darkest part of our image. And so the more tonal ranges we can create, the more dynamic range we have. And that's why RAW file formats are so valuable in wildlife photography, because it's going to allow us to save some of those brighter parts of the image and some of those darker parts of the image. Whereas if we were using JPEG, those brighter parts and darker parts would be lost because we wouldn't be able to recover them because they would be beyond the dynamic range of the JPEG image. So that's why RAW is so valuable to us. But the point I want you to take away from that is when you're looking at the light meter and shooting in the RAW file format, understand that the light meter is more aimed towards a JPEG. So the light meter that you see will be a little bit different than the image you actually get out of camera. It's not going to be as precise when photographing in RAW images. So what I always recommend you do is go out and take a series of images. Take 5 images where your light meter reads -2. Take another 5 images where your light meter is reading a 0 or a balanced exposure. And then take 5 more images where your light meter is reading a +2. Take pictures of different subjects in different lighting conditions. Just make sure each of those photos, right, those 5 photos, you got -2, 0, and +2. And then take them back to your computer later on and just look at the images. We don't care what you took a picture of, or it's not about the quality of the lighting. It's not about the quality of the images. What we're looking to see is in the RAW file format, what do your photos look like when your light meter shows a -2? This is really just aimed at getting you to better understand how your equipment reacts in real life, in real world scenarios, and what the images are going to look like when your camera tells you you're at 2 stops underexposed. I want you to understand how your equipment works and how it's performing so that you have a better understanding, because this can impact what you do with your exposures when you're out in the field. And having a good understanding of your equipment is essential. Okay, that's the light meter, guys. That's what I want you to know. Now let's quickly jump into histograms. So what I've done here is I've taken a series of pictures, and these first 6 pictures that I have here with the green and blue, the green ones are all colored images. One is taken at a balanced exposure, one is taken at 2 stops underexposed, and one is taken at 2 stops overexposed. Then what I did is I made copies of all of those and I turned them into black and white, because when we start talking about noise levels, seeing an image in black and white makes seeing the noise a little bit easier. Let's take a look at this first image though here on the far left. This is the image that is 2 stops underexposed. And if we go up to the top left corner here, we're taking a look at the luminance value of a histogram. You can also look at it in the RGB, which is going to show us the red, green, and blue light that exists along with the tonal ranges. And we can also just look at red, green, and blue channels to see whatever you want to see. I don't really use the red, green, and blue channels very often when I'm looking at histograms. I am either looking at it in RGB or luminance. And we're going to just go to luminance so that we can just boil it down to the tonal values to get a better feel for what's happening. So when we're looking at the histogram, it's very similar to that of the light meter, right? We have a histogram right now where most of the tones are favoring the left-hand side. Well, just like the light meter, anything to the left of 0, right, the left of center, is an underexposed image, and we can see that. As I go to the image that had a more balanced exposure, we can see now that the tones are shifting more towards the center of the histogram. And as I go to the 2 stops overexposed, we can see now that the tonal ranges are shifting to the right side of the histogram. So that is all that we are looking at when we are looking at a histogram. But this can help us a little bit when we're doing our editing, and we can kind of tweak our exposures using highlights and shadows and whites and blacks to kind of massage that histogram and maybe move it in a certain direction to create that ultimate look that we're going for. The one hard and fast rule that you should be aware of, and we've kind of already touched on this a little bit, but you never want your histogram to be touching the far right wall or the far left side wall. That means we're either crushing our blacks so badly that we're losing detail. If we're touching the left side, we're going to lose that detail. It's gone forever. And if we're touching the right side of the wall, we're doing that whole clipping thing, right? Where the image is becoming too bright, the highlights are getting too bright, and we're losing detail when it starts to clip, and we won't be able to recover that detail. So we want to be cautious. Now, as I mentioned, maybe that's a small spot in the sky that blew out, right? But as a general rule, a good way to really work on exposing your images is to always avoid the left and right walls being touched by your histogram. This will just keep you in a much safer zone, and this will help you later on when it comes to the editing process. All right, now it's time to talk about the signal to noise ratio, right? This is where we're talking about how much light we're letting in, the ratio of light compared to the ratio of noise. Now, what I want to prove to you is that ISO does not determine how much noise is in our image. It is the combination of our shutter speed and the aperture that we're using. So let's take a look at this. If we take a look at these 3 images, again, I moved them to black and white, so we're going to be dealing with the black and white. But what we can see is that all of these images used a 1/200 shutter speed and an f2.8 aperture. So I did this test indoors with my 70 to 180 lens. And again, this is just for demonstration purposes. But the point here is that the aperture and the shutter speed are the same for all images. So here's the first one, and you can see that I had an ISO of 800. This was the 2-stop underexposed one. This is the next one. This is the balanced one. And this is 1/200 again, 2.8. And we went from an ISO of 800 to an ISO of 3200. And then the last image is 2 stops overexposed. But what you can see is I still had the 1/200 and the f2.8, but now I have an ISO of 12,800. What I did with these 3 black and white images is I brightened them in post-production here inside of DxO Photolab 8, just so they're all the same brightness so that we can actually look at the noise levels. Now, keep in mind, changing the exposure in your photo editing software will do nothing to change the noise level of your images. That is baked in at the time of image capture. So whatever you do in your camera is going to set that noise profile. And then whatever you do in post-production will have no impact on that whatsoever. But let's take a look. All right, we have 800, 3200, and 12,800 for ISO. So if I were to ask you what's going to happen, I would be willing to bet most of you are going to go, well, 800 is going to be your cleanest looking image. And then 3200 is going to have quite a bit more noise in it. And then 12,800 is going to have a ton more noise in it because you're raising that ISO. But I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. We use the same shutter and the same aperture, and our noise levels do not change regardless of ISO. And let's take a look at what I'm talking about. So I am going to set this image right here. I'm going to use this as our reference image. This is just how it works in DxO. And then I'm going to click on the image here with the 3200. And what I'm going to do, and what I did is if you take a look at, I'm just going to go back to a single image here. This first blue image, there was an S over here. And what I did is I took the remove tool and just kind of messed it up a little bit so that you could see that this image is different from the others. Okay, so here's that image again. And then we're going to go back to the compare mode, and I'm going to click on this. And so now you can see, right, we have the messed up S over here on the left, and here is the S on the 3200 image. Let's zoom into this little grid of the color squares so that we can take a look at the noise levels. Okay, and what we can see right off the rip, okay, if we look at this image, like these squares, right, these charcoal gray squares, we have the same noise profiles going on in the 800 as we do the 3200 image. There is nothing different about those noise levels. This square is the same as this one, and this square is the same as that one, and so on down the line. This square is the same as this one. The noise levels don't change because shutter speed and aperture are driving noise levels. ISO should be very different here from 800 to 3200 if ISO is actually changing that. Let's click on the 12,800 image. Once again, this is the 800 image, right? So I'm going to zoom back out just so you can see we got the messed up S here. I'm going to click on the 12,800 image and we got the S there. So we're going to zoom in, drag these down, and we once again have the same noise images, the same noise profiles going on here, right? If we look at this one to this one and this one to this one, the same noise profile. This is ISO 800 compared to ISO 12,800. That is a huge difference in 12,800 to ISO 800. There should be a ton more grain going on in the right-hand image if ISO truly dictates how much noise is going on, but it doesn't. This is the signal to noise ratio. We are still getting the same amount of light with that aperture and shutter speed. So that is kind of baking in a certain noise profile, if you will. The ISO, as I explained earlier in the video, is simply a knob that is changing our brightness levels. I want to take a look at another example. And we're going to look at some color examples here. Now I'm going to set this as the reference image here on the right. And then I'm going to compare. I'm going to click on this one. Now, both of these images were taken using an ISO of 12,800. So we're using a high ISO, right? So in theory, if ISO controls what we're doing from an ISO standpoint, two images with 12,800 should look very similar when it comes to noise, right? But it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because the first image here, this image on the left, was taken using a shutter speed of 1/160 with a aperture of 2.8 and the ISO of 12,800. The second image was taken using a shutter speed of 1/3200, 2.8, 12,800. So the only thing changing here is the shutter speed. We have one at 3200, one at 160. So obviously at 160, we're letting in a ton more light. But we're still using the same 12,800 ISO. So if ISO is controlling noise, these noise profiles should be the same. But when we zoom in, we can very easily and very quickly see the difference here in the noise levels. I mean, look at that, right? Not even comparable. And they're both 12,800 ISO. So what we are seeing here is that with the one on the left, when we slowed up our shutter speed and we let more light into the camera, we improved our signal to noise ratio. And in turn, we reduced the noise immensely, even using a high ISO of 12,800. But when we use that 12,800 and we slow down our shutter speed, or actually should say speed up our shutter speed to 1/3200, now we get a lot more noise because we're killing how much light is coming into the camera. We're really shutting that down. And so we're really decreasing our signal to noise ratio, and that is bad. The takeaway here, guys, and the problem becomes with wildlife photography is we often have to work with higher shutter speeds, 1/2000, 1/2500, sometimes even higher, many times even higher. because we want to freeze the action. But what I want you to think about when you go out into the fields, I want you to stop worrying about what ISO you're using. I want you to be far more aware of what shutter speed you're using, because that is going to determine your noise profile, right? We know that we're going to be working with apertures of f6.3, f5.6. We know that, right? That's pretty common in wildlife photography. So we're going to be more focused on that shutter speed. This is why we want to use tripods. This is why we want to use monopods. If you're hand holding, then I highly recommend you put a lot of time in practicing your technique for hand holding. Put some time in and practice in really understanding how slow of a shutter speed you can use while hand holding before you start to introduce camera shake, especially if you're trying to photograph a moving animal. If you're trying to photograph a moving animal and you're moving the camera at the same time to track them, it's going to be really difficult to use those slower shutter speeds and not introduce camera shake. Get out there, practice this, know your equipment, know your technique, know when you start to get blurry photos because the shutter speed is just too slow to hand hold. I recommend you get on a tripod or the monopod so that you can work a lot more comfortably and a lot more confidently using these slower shutter speeds, right? If you can photograph a still bird or a still animal that's really not moving or not moving that much, don't be afraid to bring that shutter speed down to 1/500, 1/250, even with the higher ISO. You are going to be able to greatly reduce the amount of noise in your image by using that slower shutter speed. The problem arises is a high ISO with a fast shutter speed, because the fast shutter speed is killing the amount of light coming into the camera and therefore killing our signal to noise ratio. Guys, that is all for today's video. Let me know, did you learn something today? Is this going to change what you do when you go out to photograph wildlife? I think it is. I think it is, because I think you're going to look at ISO differently, and I think you're going to realize just how important shutter speed is when it comes to photographing wildlife. Now, of course, we have to use that shutter speed to capture the action before us, but when we have some flexibility with it, make sure you're really being aware of what you're doing with that shutter speed. Thanks so much for stopping by today. If you learned something, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. And hey, thank you so much for spending time with me. Good luck in your wildlife. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Take care.